So thank you for having me. And I just wanted to reiterate thank you to Sadie and Catherine at the IAS. And also thank you to Elizabeth McGill and Gregory Hartwell, who are also authors on this report. In terms of the structure of this, I'll start by giving a brief overview of the aims of this research and a summary of what was done, and then give some context around what unhealthy commodity industries are and what corporate political activity means, a couple of examples, and then also a little bit of rationale about why this research was done. So why we compared these two unhealthy commodity industries, the alcohol and the gambling industries, and why we looked at these two House of Lords inquiries. And then speak a little bit about the methods and discuss the findings in context of other research on other unhealthy commodity industries, and then briefly give some recommendations. So the aim of this work was to compare and contrast strategies, arguments, and framings used in alcohol and gambling industry responses to two UK government consultations. And the industry responses responses by industry we compared came from the House of Lords inquiry into the Alcohol Licensing Act 2003, which was carried out in 2016 and 2017. And then also the House of Lords inquiry into the social and economic impact of the gambling industry, which was carried out in 2019 and 2020. And just quickly, I should say, House of Lords select committees can hold a call for evidence, which is what the inquiries we're looking into today are. And anyone can respond to these, including industry, but also public health stakeholders and individuals. And then the House of Lords committee would write a report based on the evidence to which the government must respond. And both of these inquiries are relatively recent. They follow a similar format, and they both gathered insight into the successes and shortcomings of current alcohol and gambling acts in England, their related regulation and other issues, which makes them suitable for comparison. Some of you on the call might be familiar with these two terms, unhealthy commodity industries and corporate political activity. So apologies if this is a bit of repetition, but for those of you who aren't, Nye and colleagues describe unhealthy commodity industries as a collective term used to describe industries or groups of corporations where a significant share of their product portfolio comprises of unhealthy commodities with high profit margins aimed at or easily accessible to a large number of consumers. So for example, these include the tobacco, alcohol, ultra-processed food, and gambling industries. And consumption of these products produced by these industries represent major public health concerns. And regulation of these UCIs has proven difficult and complex for a number of reasons, but it's at least in part due to their involvement in public health policy. So the way in which corporations use their power to influence policy decisions so that they can secure a policy environment which is conducive to the consumption of their products is known as corporate political activity, and it's really the subject of this study. In policymaking, corporate political activity can be used as a means to frame harms from UCIs in their industry's favour, and framing can be considered as a way to promote certain views and perspectives around harms and their solutions as a dominant discourse, and in this way, UCIs can influence policy decisions. There's evidence that UCIs use similar strategies as each other as part of their corporate political activity. So for example, evidence from the tobacco and alcohol industry have shown that misrepresenting evidence of harm or emphasizing individual responsibility around those harms are common strategies to subvert policy. So considering the conflict of interest between UCIs and public health interest, many public health researchers have questioned the legitimacy of their involvement in policy making. And then just quickly, I wanted to give a bit of rationale on why we decided to compare the alcohol and gambling industry. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, there's evidence to suggest that UCIs employ similar tactics when trying to influence policy. But also, while alcohol and gambling differ in many ways, they're also similar in lots of important ways as well. So they're both common in modern society. They can both lead to health harms. They co-occur. They both represent major public health concerns. and also generally have a liberal set of laws governing them. In addition, harms from alcohol and gambling are difficult problems to solve, as they're embedded social norms, glamorized in the media and pervasively marketed, and also they can be addictive. And then why look at their responses to government consultation, so the House of Lords inquiries, which we're looking at? Well, we can analyze their responses to see the strategies and the framings they use as part of their corporate political activity. So given the similarities in alcohol and gambling harms, and evidence that UCIs use similar strategies to subvert regulation, but considering the fact that there's relatively few studies which compare different UCIs and even fewer which look at the gambling industry, there was a good rationale to compare the CPA of the alcohol and gambling industry. I'll just speak about the method really briefly. So responses to both inquiries were available on the UK Parliament website, and industry responses were identified from all the responses using the World Health Organization's definition of the alcohol industry and an adapted version for the gambling industry. So then the responses were then analysed using thematic analysis, and we compared the industry responses from the alcohol and gambling industry to understand the similarities and differences in the strategies, arguments and framings used by the gambling industry in their corporate political activity. So coming on to the results, a total of 161 and 98 written responses were submitted to the alcohol and gambling inquiry respectively, and a decent proportion of these responses came from industry. The themes in the arguments and strategies identified in the responses were organized into two overarching frames. So how they frame the problem of gambling and alcohol harm, and how they frame the solution to those harms. Many themes were identified, but we'll just concentrate on the most salient and reoccurring, which I'll come on to now. So in terms of how the industry framed the problem of alcohol and gambling, alcohol industry and gambling industry actors framed the problem of alcohol and gambling similarly. So they emphasized that the harms were only experienced by a minority of people, while the majority drink and gamble responsibly. They also deflected the problem to other industry actors and also seek to downplay the issue, so claiming that alcohol misuse or problem gambling prevalence is low, or pointing out flaws in gambling research. So as I said, both of the alcohol and gambling industry responses to the inquiries emphasized that most people drink and gamble responsibly, though they never really defined this notion of responsible consumption. And industries also generally took quite a narrow view of alcohol and gambling harm. So they largely limited harm to a small minority who drink in excess. So for example, one alcohol industry trade association said, millions of people go out in the UK and across London every week without incident and enjoy themselves, form new friendships, relax, get inspired and go home. And then another example from a gambling operator was that, unfortunately, for a small percentage of people, gambling ceases to be an entertainment and can cause personal, social, financial, and health problems. Some of the responses also really stress the concept of individual responsibility, arguing that industry can't be penalized for the actions of the minority of people or operators who act irresponsibly. So, for example, one alcohol retailer said, more can be done to ensure that a distinction between personal responsibility and a business's responsibility is made. We can point to examples where action appears to have been taken against us as license holders, where in fact our publicans are just as much victims of criminal action as anyone else. And these tactics are quite consistent with wider research into unhealthy commodity industries. This narrow view of harms and individual responsibility framing kind of serves industry agenda. It distances industry actors from the problems caused by consumption and puts the onus on individuals to act responsibility, and shifts the blame of alcohol and gambling harm to those who misuse those products. But it ignores industry's roles in the environments in which these harms can happen. Industry actors also assert that they can't be held responsible for the actions of irresponsible individuals, which implicitly suggests that population level regulation is unfair, which is another theme, and I'll come on to that in a later slide. Another theme which came out of the responses was that industry claimed that the evidence of harms of alcohol and gambling is overstated. So this took the form of quoting evidence or claiming that the overall trends in alcohol consumption have fallen, that the prevalence of problem gambling is low, or that underage drinking or gambling is low, or alcohol and gambling related crime is low. And this selective citation of industry favorable research to argue that alcohol and gambling harms are overstated is also again seen in wider research regarding unhealthy commodity industries. And it serves to shape the evidence base around a preferred narrative. And for example, the statistics that they highlight, that industry responses highlighted in their responses to the inquiry sort of ignore the fact that, for example, alcohol is still the leading cause of death among 15 to 49-year-olds in the UK. And what was especially striking in the gambling industry submissions to their House of Lords inquiry was that they commonly pointed out flaws in gambling research in order to cast doubt on the science and scientists. So this included highlighting that there was a dearth of reliable data available, and a couple of responses went as far as to imply that researchers were biased. So for example, one gambling trade association said, "It is our perception that research is dominated by middle-class academic thinking, and it does not accommodate a sufficiently wide range of potentially difficult views from others." And then the final theme around the way the problem was framed by industry actors relates to blame shifting. So when assigning causation to the problem of drinking and gambling, both the alcohol and gambling industries sought to shift blame to either other unhealthy commodity industries or other parts of their industries, which is quite an interesting finding. So on-trade alcohol retailers, so pubs, etc., argue that more alcohol is sold by the off-trade, so supermarkets, etc. And they argue that this facilitates binge drinking or preloading, which is drinking alcohol sometimes in large quantities before going out. And they also argued that on-trade venues are safer to drink in as they're supervised. And then similarly, the gambling industry responses made very similar arguments. So they argued that onshore or land-based gambling operators appeared to seek to shift blame. So they argue that onshore or land-based gambling operators are safer because they've got safeguards and controls for vulnerable customers, and gambling is supervised. And then this shifting blame argument was generally used to oppose further regulation on the on-trade or land-based gambling, as they argue that the restrictions on them are considered disproportionate to the off-trade or online gambling. In addition, some industry responses suggested that the dislike for gambling industry seems to stem from excessive sports betting advertising. And this is quite a noteworthy finding, as public health literature tends to refer to industry views and framings as unanimous, although as you can see here, the arguments used by subsectors are sometimes divergent and depend on whether the proposed regulation will affect them. So for example, one gambling trade association said, we believe one, if not the primary reason for the prevalence of anti-gambling industry related sentiment in the UK is both the volume and the tone of advertising in and around televised sports events. So this general dislike of excessive sports betting advertising by non-sports betting gambling industry actors identified here kind of warrants more further research, because a fragmented industry could provide a potential avenue for public health policymakers to make a case for regulation in the public health's interest. And then coming on to the way that industry actors frame the solution to the problem of alcohol use in gambling, it can be split into two categories. So the solutions that the industry favored and the solutions that were opposed by the industry. And the way that the problem was framed, so only affecting a minority of irresponsible or at-risk consumers appeared to affect the solutions that were promoted. So they promoted local and targeted solutions, and they discouraged population level regulation. In the majority of responses, both the alcohol and gambling industries present themselves as part of the solution, emphasizing the importance and the advantages of working with industry. So arguments they used saying industry has access to data and consumers for research, that industry can provide expertise, and that partnership approaches between industry and local communities or government are the most effective and the most fair. Some of the industry actors made reference to the negative connotations and possible conflict of interest associated with working with industry, where they argue that when it's done appropriately, operator input into solutions is beneficial. So, for example, one offshore gambling operator said, further, we acknowledge that and agree that independence is important. However, if done appropriately, we believe that operators can have an important role to play, given our expertise, access to data, and our understanding of that data and its context. And then, as part of presenting themselves as the solution, as part of the solution to alcohol or gambling related harms, industry actors also portrayed themselves as socially responsible, and they highlighted their contributions to a safer drinking and gambling environment. And so this generally served to promote voluntary or self-regulation of industry, since the industry argue that they already have proven their commitment to social responsibility. So, for example, one gambling industry trade association said, important restrictions on advertising have been implemented in recent years through self-regulation and the actions of regulatory bodies without the need for legislation. We believe that this approach offers the greatest opportunity for agile responses to concerns while allowing benefits to be retained for recreational gamblers. And as I said, the majority of alcohol and gambling industry responses framed alcohol and gambling harm as a problem for only a minority of irresponsible or at-risk consumers. And so therefore they implied that such solutions to harms should be targeted at those individuals so that we don't compromise the enjoyment for responsible consumers. So most alcohol industry and gambling industry responses were mainly opposed to population level measures. Both framed population level approaches as too simple to solve such complex problems as alcohol and gambling related harms. So, for example, one alcohol trade association said in reference to restrictions on super strength alcohol products, blanket approaches to control so-called super strength products are ineffective in tackling complex alcohol related issues and are in stark contrast to the collaborative and locally targeted initiatives that are broadly considered by the majority of stakeholders as the preferred approach. This is a relatively common theme seen in wider literature, and these complexity arguments used by industry manipulate public health concepts in order to undermine scientific consensus over population level measures and aim to distance industry as major contributors to alcohol and gambling harms. Industry actors also commonly listed the potential harms of implementing population level measures which weren't in their favor. So a variety of different potential harms were given, and sometimes it was backed up by evidence and sometimes it wasn't. Harms suggested by industry can be split into three categories. So they spoke about harms to the consumer, harms to a responsible industry, and harms to the wider economy. Both industries also highlighted how population level regulation ignores the benefits of their industries. So for example, the cultural contribution of pubs and bars, all the social aspects and enjoyment of alcohol and gambling. So in terms of harms to the consumer, industry cited that there would be unintended consequences of population level regulation on consumer choice, that it could push consumers into riskier behavior, it could push consumers away from the on-trade or land-based gambling, where drinking and gambling is supervised. Gambling industry argued that forcing them to participate in a mandatory levy would reduce their incentive to fund research, education, and treatment. Alcohol industry argued that introducing minimum unit pricing will have a disproportionate impact on people with a low income. And then among harms to a responsible industry, both alcohol and gambling industry responses cited that it would have a negative impact on businesses and jobs, and it would have and in terms of the alcohol industry, cited that population level regulation would have a negative impact on the on-trade. And then finally, a small number of alcohol industry and gambling industry responses also commented on the impact of population level regulation on the wider economy. So this included commenting on the impact of restrictions on other industries which are dependent on the alcohol and gambling industry, or losses to government in terms of tax, among a few other arguments. And so by highlighting these harms or unintended consequences of population level regulation, industry actors cast doubt on the success and public support of solutions that are not in their favor. In conclusion, overall, industries use largely the same framing of the problem and the solution to alcohol and gambling related harms. Arguments used by both industries were sort of mutually reinforcing. So framing of the problem as one that only affects a small minority of people, emphasizing individual responsibility and shifting blame to other industry actors, implicitly framed population level regulation as redundant and favored industry preferred solutions such as targeted and local solutions. And the striking similarities in the framing and the arguments used by both alcohol industry and gambling industry actors supports the belief that UCIs generally use the same corporate political strategies to shape the narrative in the favor of their commercial interests. And then I just wanted to end with a few recommendations. So due to a strong conflict of interest in industry involvement in public health policy, this study supports calls by others that unhealthy commodity industries must be excluded from government partnerships and the decision-making process, which is the case for the tobacco industry. And then policymakers and researchers should also be careful not to take a narrow view of gambling and alcohol harm. And this study supports calls by others for a reframing of gambling and alcohol harms, which takes into account harms experienced by society and recognizes the contribution of commercial actors and policymakers in the environment in which harms can happen. That's it. Thank you very much.
We had a comment or a question from Magdalena Boo in Sheffield, which was, to what extent do you feel that the legality of alcohol and gambling impacts on how difficult it is to get a clear narrative on harms accepted? Does that make sense, or as a question? So, the fact that these are legal industries, does that make it difficult to get that narrative accepted that they're also harmful?
Yeah, I think that's possibly true. That I think it's more that they're like widely embedded into culture and society, and like marketed by media. Like they're a really big common part of our lives, and so it's hard to get to shape the narrative into so that they can be harmful, especially the gambling industry, because it's only very recently been considered as a public health problem. And I think we need to do a little bit more work sort of emphasizing that gambling can have harms, and also that the harms are not just for a select few of people who have really severe problems. Like harms for gambling are on a continuum, and I think we really need to emphasize that as well.
Yeah, I agree. Another question from Son Dao, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly there, which was, do you identify the connection between alcohol and gambling industry? So do they use the same funded researchers to create their evidence, or the same think tanks to promote their agendas or their policy solutions? Did you uncover any of that? Because certainly we see that with tobacco and alcohol industries, that they quite often are driven by the same sort of bodies, aren't they?
That's a good question. I didn't look into it specifically, but when looking at the responses, some of the responses were quite similar in the alcohol and gambling industries, and it does imply that they collaborate. But I didn't look into it specifically.
My question is just around the use of the industry's own charitable organisations that they influence to do their research. So I'm thinking of the likes of Gamble Aware and Drink Aware, and whether there's any thematic analysis on their reliance of their own funded organisations, if you will, and if you have any reflections on that.
Definitely, both of them responded to both inquiries, and I think there's definitely this accepted in the gambling industry that I know a bit more about the gambling industry than the alcohol industry, but in the gambling industry, that a lot of the research is funded, in education is funded by the gambling industry, and so when it kind of means that we have a small pool of researchers, and also that the research on gambling is quite narrow. So there's a lot about treatment and individual and targeted solutions, but less so on population level measures. So I definitely agree in that respect.
Hello, yes, thanks very much for your presentation, Saloni. You've done very well. I mean, clearly this is an important agenda, but there's probably another side to the coin, which is ensuring that we've got our own house in order in terms of the quality of arguments that we're able to bring to bear. And it just occurred to me as you were speaking that, the fundamental attribution error where, a psychological bias, rule of thumb, that causes us to attribute the reason for somebody cutting us off in the road on the way to work in the morning is because the other driver was had a poor character or was incompetent, rather than realizing that they were late for work or they were distracted or something like that. And I think it's quite important that we're able to articulate some of the arguments that we're making about unhealthy industries through the lens of us just being absolutely certain that our interpretations are not contaminated by some of those attribution errors.
So what I'm saying, so local authority licence committees, we are responsible authority in public health for alcohol, but not for gambling. And within alcohol, there isn't a public health licensing objective. So we have to shoehorn anything around public health under, for example, public safety. So we have to say there's a safety issue because there's higher mortality from alcohol in this area, or there's a safety issue because this premise fits the profile for a premise that's likely to suffer a glass-related injury. So we're always trying to fit our evidence under the best fit category, and like I said, for gambling there isn't one. So we very rarely are able to, because of the permissive culture, we're very rarely able to object to licenses, and we have to fall back on license conditions that to try and moderate and mitigate the harms. And I know from colleagues when they have and from my own experience, that the industry, they have the ability to hire lawyers and barristers, whereas local authority legal support, I think it kind of intimidates local authorities in terms of making a stand. So that almost you get local authorities kind of rolling over before the challenge because it is so permissive and because they know what kickback they're going to get. So yeah, so it's not really a question, it's more how do we use what we know effectively? Because if it is down to targeted local solutions and local challenge, then it's really difficult for local authorities to manage that.
Thank you. That's a really good point. Yeah, I think it is really difficult for go up against the gambling industry when when they have more resources, and when you haven't got it in the law, to be able to not reject their licenses, etc., on the basis of public health. But I think that, yeah, I'm not really too sure. I think we need more rules and stuff in place for that. But also probably it would help if we had more research and more appreciation of gambling as a public health harm as well, because I don't think it is seen that way by everyone. And if we got more of that reframing of gambling more generally, that would really go a long way to being able to reject gambling licenses on that basis.
Too, and as background, I'm an independent public health policy analyst, and I spend a lot of time thinking about evidence and considering, the sources of the evidence and what it says and the conclusions that it draws. And one of the things that I noted about that excellent presentation was that there was a criticism about this use of the phrase responsible, consumption or activity, depending on whether you're talking about gambling or alcohol. And so if one of the criticisms is that the industry isn't really defining it, they're being quite vague, it's got that individual responsibility element attached to it, then what would we consider to be a definition? Or is there none? And kind of connected to that, the report makes some recommendations about banning these companies from being involved in public policy debates along the lines of tobacco companies. And therefore there's a question about, well, if the ban for tobacco is because it's incapable of being consumed responsibly, because it's a danger for everyone at any dose, then are we saying a similar thing about alcohol? And I mean, gambling comes into this, but I appreciate that this is mainly about alcohol. And so, if we're not comfortable with any level of risk, does that mean that we're edging our way towards arguing for prohibition? So I appreciate it's a little bit vague and nebulous, and possibly incapable of being answered.
Thank you, Celia. And I think, to some extent, Simone sort of provided the answer, which was about, low risk, trying to sort of shape a low risk environment and make sure that there are treatments and things for people who need it. Simone, I don't know if you're still with us and had anything to add before I invite some of the other questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Just by way of clarification, I lead on gambling related harm in Yorkshire and the Humber for the Office of Health Improvement and Disparities. And it's really great to see the work that Saloni's done here with her colleagues. In response to some of the points that Celia's raised, I totally get where she's coming from. I think what we need to be really careful of is falling into the same narrative that is perpetuated by industry, which is making a value judgment of whether drinking or gambling or any type of behaviour. It's quite often described as fun and enjoyable, and actually it's a value judgment, and it's not something that, if we're coming from an evidence-based perspective, that we should be indulging in. We shouldn't be demonising or glorifying any of these behaviours. It should be sticking to the facts, which is about levels of risk. And if we can't guarantee that there is no level of risk, then we need to, I think, maximise the safety of environments to protect those that are the most vulnerable. Because when it comes down to it, this is an issue of inequalities and about protecting people who can't protect themselves. So I just try to take that emotion out of the equation and maybe examine, when we see responsible gambling, responsible drinking literature, to kind of examine the sources of that and where it's come from. Quite often you will see some influence of industry along the way, and that's something that I think as public health practitioners we can all have a role in kind of just being a little bit more cautious about how we use the language. And I think it's just that helping to kind of reframe and sort of empower, which in itself should help people who feel stigmatized to be able to talk about the harms caused and come forward and seek treatment. So that would be a win-win for me. So I don't know if that simplifies somewhat, but I think it maybe helps to explain why those terms are currently problematic as I kind of interpret it anyway.
And my question is simply around the rise in the value and rise in lived experience, and how that stacks up against industry knowledge and even challenges what we consider as valuable evidence when we look at gambling related harms. There's a saying in certainly in Indigenous circles that says nothing for us without us. And perhaps that's something that fits here in terms of utilizing the lived experience of gamblers in terms of changing the conversation and narrative with regards to the industry narrative that is prevalent. And just wondering about others' thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely agree that including lived experience people is in the solutions to harms, and also encountering industry narrative is really important, because obviously those are the people who have actually experienced the harms and know what solutions and things would be beneficial to them in terms of in terms of possible treatment and etc. Or in the sense of, for example, in gambling, if we want to find people suffering from gambling earlier, because right now when interventions are generally targeted at those who are right towards the severe end of harm, then it would be really useful, especially in that respect, to get the knowledge of lived experience people and what maybe the barriers, etc., of coming forward or for help, etc., would be really important. And yeah, if anyone else has any other comments as well.
The other thing I would just like to add is this whole notion of the intergenerational harms and lifespan harms that exist with gambling. It would seem that there may be within that realm an ability to identify the highly vulnerable, the high-risk groups via the generational aspects of this, and in terms of wondering if any of that work is happening around the world as well.
Yeah, I'm not too clued up on it, but yeah, definitely agree that intergenerational family being able to identify gambling related harms is probably a really significant avenue, but I'm not sure if anybody else has any thoughts, because I'm not very...
Where you're not allowed to advertise alcoholic drinks, you often get a brand, like I will mention one brand, which is Heineken, and it advertises non-alcoholic drinks. And I have to say that I've been asked, is that alibi branding? I really don't know. I haven't heard of the term alibi branding, but it could be. I thought how nice to mention non-alcoholic drinks, because that's actually what keeps me, and I'm going to talk sober. And then I realized that it was actually a very clever way to get the term of the manufacturer Heineken mentioned, because it's actually mentioning the same person who manufactures a non-alcoholic drink as the alcoholic drink. And I hadn't thought of that being used as a form of advertising alcoholic drink, which it is. And I just thought it was quite interesting. And I thought, is there anything in gambling that can be used in that way? That, on the surface, it's quite something that's not associated, but of course it is. And it's a good way of advertising.
Thanks, Diane. That's a good question. I think safer, if you ever watch televised sports, there's often safer gambling messaging.
Yes.
And they're usually about industry use them to highlight their controls, etc., that they have, and but there's been a lot of analysis, a couple of papers analyzing them, and I think they've been shown to more just get the the name of the gambling company out there, and they're not that effective at increasing education around quote responsible gambling, but possibly more effective in just serving to advertise themselves, etc. So I think they're quite similar. That's quite similar.
It is, yes. I see the connection. Okay, thanks for that.
Yep. I'm asking this question because I'm working in tobacco control and SSB, and sometimes we have different understanding of the risks. The consensus in the government, and therefore there's some differences in terms of the policy we want to achieve. For example, in taxations, so that leads to the differences and sometimes contradicting arguments used by the different industries, and it sometimes makes us very hard to counter, because they're using differences. I'm not sure because I missed some of the presentations and I haven't read the paper yet. So I just want to raise this question to see if you did anything about this in your studies, and do you see that it's a worthwhile to see this point? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question. I think the risks from alcohol and gambling are different in lots of ways, but they're also similar, and they co-occur. And I think but then it does manifest in different ways in the different arguments they use. But also largely, the alcohol and gambling industry used a lot of the same arguments, despite like maybe differences in their risks on causing problematic consumption of their products. So they all use like emphasizing that it's only a risk. Harm is only a risk for a small number of people, and harm is only the risk for those who act irresponsibly, etc. So I think it's quite good to like look at the similarities in those arguments, and then government can develop like public health messaging, which is consistent across all industries with unhealthy commodities, because a more like unified approach, which emphasizes the similarities, would be quite useful, I think.
Thank you. I have a question actually, Saloni, because it's something of interest to us, which is this divisions within the sectors, so between the on and off trade in alcohol and between the on and offshore operators in gambling. Have you come across other literature, other researchers that have found those same divisions, and is it a kind of an opportunity for us in a way? Could we exploit those divisions in order to formulate policy?
I haven't found that much. I haven't found that much other research around them. There's one paper which looks at the cleavages in the alcohol industry, which is cited in the report, between the on trade and the off trade. But in terms of the gambling industry, especially the finding the difference between onshore and offshore, and also in terms of the difference between the sports betting sports betting industry and other industry actors, the differences in them. So the non-sports betting in gambling industry actors being relatively pro ban on sports betting advertising is quite interesting, because like the cleavages and like the fragmentation between different industry actors can kind of be an avenue for possibly for policymakers to make an argument for regulation, for example, around advertising, for one, definitely.
Yeah, it does seem to be an interesting split, when quite often you see sort of quite a lot of collegiate behaviours between different facets of industry. It's quite interesting when you start to see any chinks at all. We had a comment from Linda, and I don't know, Saloni, if you wanted to comment on this just from the perspective of OHID more generally in your current role, rather than this research, which was, is anybody looking at the role of the internet and sort of less controls or arguably more targeting of adverts to young people, and also that sort of unknown quantity, really, how many people are seeing it? Is it something that is being looked at a policy level?
It's definitely an area of interest, in the Public Health England Gambling Review did identify that online gambling has gone up and is a significant area of interest, but I don't really work exactly on the policy in terms of that, so I can't really answer it. But I could if you're interested, put you in touch with someone who does work on gambling more and alcohol more.
Thank you so much, Saloni, for presenting your research today. That was so helpful. And thank you to everybody on the call for your engagement in the discussion. That's been so helpful. And I think we've got a lot of resources and signposting from all your interactions. So thank you again, and I wish you an enjoyable rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.